Good morning or good evening, wherever you happen to be in the world today. Welcome to the first in a series of alumni-led energy-focused conversations for the OBA network of the Said Business School and Oxford University. Great to have all of you here today. And this is for students and alumni from all over the world. And I think we do span quite a number of time zones, with myself in San Francisco, Eric in Seattle, as well as the London crowd, and then spanning all the way through Europe and into Asia. A little bit about myself. My name is Jimmy Gia, and I graduated from SBS 2008-2009 and currently work in climate finance. And so in some ways, the recession that we're in right now is reminiscent of what went through in 2008-2009 when I was doing my MBA. At the moment, I'm an energy entrepreneur and professor and writer within the energy and clean tech sector, and very happy to be hosting this conversation with Eric. A couple of housekeeping points. First off, please keep the microphones muted and cameras off. This session will be recorded for later reference as well as later use. And please post your questions inside of the chat box function at the bottom of the screen. I've prepared a number of questions for conversations with Eric, but the interactive part becomes interesting if we are able to feel free to contribute your questions as well. And so just to kick us off, let me introduce Eric Redman. Eric has a long and storied career within the energy sector, whether it's in environmental law or in project development for wind, solar, and carbon capture. But he also serves on the President's Council at Ceres in Boston, which was the organization that created the GRIs many years ago. And he also teaches energy policy at UC San Diego in the School of Global Policy and Strategy. Relevant to us, he's both a graduate of Harvard and Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar back in the 1970s, as well as the Harvard Law School. And perhaps just a personal story about Eric was just simply how we met. And this is also a story of how to do networking post-Oxford, I think, which is I was at an energy networking event in Seattle where I lived for a decade, and I was wearing my college scarf. And this lady approaches me and says, "Hey, is that a Magdalen College scarf that you're wearing?" And I'm just looking at her going, I did not expect that, but yes, this is a Magdalen College scarf. And she says, "That's great. My husband went to Magdalen. You need to go and meet him." And so a couple of weeks later, I was having coffee with Eric here, and that's how we started off our relationship. I don't even remember how many years ago now, but it must have been quite some time ago. So Eric, thank you so much for joining us today and being part of this event.
I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for having me. It's nice to be tied back in this fashion to our global network of Oxonians. Okay, I'll start my video also.
Excellent.
Great. If you can see me here, I'm number one, growing a beard in quarantine. I've never had a beard before in my life. I'm not sure how I like this one yet, but it's not because of a razor shortage. It's just because of the silly notion that, well, if we don't have to go to the office, why don't we grow a beard? And then we spend all day on Zoom and Teams, and it doesn't make any sense. But the background there is the University of St. Andrews, where my daughter is finishing up a master's degree right now and will soon come home. If I put my actual background, you'd see that I've converted her bedroom into my office, and I don't want her to see that when I'm talking with her. So that's why I posted to St. Andrews there. I'm really delighted to be here. My understanding is it's intended to be as an interview, and I don't have any opening statement of any kind other than to say one thing that's happened the last couple of days, which is if you've been around the energy sector, and particularly the clean tech sector, long enough, there have been a couple of times in the past where just when clean tech was starting to launch in energy, suddenly global oil prices plunged and wiped out a lot of what had been the drivers for getting the clean energy movement going. And on the fringes, there were sort of conspiracy theories that this was why the prices were being dropped, was for the very purpose of keeping clean energy from taking off. I never accepted that. I think these global petro giants have got other things on their minds than that. But in this latest round where we are today, and as of this moment in the US, the May contracts are now trading for under $1 a barrel. Where we are now, I think that we never thought it was going to come again, but I think that how this is going to impact clean energy and climate is very much an open question. And even though it's probably driven by a desire of the Saudis and the Russians to perhaps get the frackers out of business in North America, because in Saudi Arabia, they think their lifting cost per barrel or something like $5 or $10. And I imagine in Russia, it's much the same. At these prices, of course, all the people in the fracking industry in the US would go bankrupt. So I think that has a bigger thing going on. But this time, the conspiracy involves our own president right out in the open, trying to get the cartel back on its feet. And it's quite an amazing thing. So ironically, if Trump succeeds in getting the price of oil back up, maybe we're going to be okay. I see from Gerhard that the price of oil for this May delivery is now negative. One thing you have to know about this really low price and negative prices, this is for some futures contracts where if you hold the contract, you're obligated to take delivery of the physical oil in Cushing, Oklahoma. And so obviously people are not in a position to drive down to Cushing even with low gasoline prices and pick up this much oil. So that's why they're trying to unload the contracts. At any rate, enough of that. Why don't we proceed, Jimmy, however you'd like.
Yeah, well, actually, you anticipated my first question, which was in comparison of what we are going through today with the 2008 financial crisis. And do you see any market similarities going on in the energy sector, and whether there's lessons that we can learn from what happened 10 years ago?
Yes, although there are a couple layers to that. To me, the most dramatic thing that happened back in that time, it coincided with the end of the venture community in the United States and elsewhere in the world. It coincided with the end of the venture community having its first, one-nighter with the clean tech sector. So when the venture world realized that clean tech was going to be a thing and that decarbonization and climate change were going to drive changes in energy, Silicon Valley and others rushed to make investments in startup companies. And almost all of those turned out to be dramatic losses. And a lot of people in those firms lost their jobs and everything else. And it was frustrating because I think they didn't go about it in a very well-informed way. They were used to funding things that did not create physical products. And in the energy sector, you're creating, whether it's a megawatt hour or a kilowatt hour or a megawatt or a kilowatt, you are creating things in the electric power sector that are physical, that trade, at real prices and have to be delivered and so forth. And I don't think they grasped that very well. So they invested in a lot of things that sounded nice, sort of shiny new objects flashing past their eyes, but which really weren't going to fit into the real world energy sector very well. And so they all became disillusioned at the same time. And they all just swore they would never get back in the business. And for about 10 years, they didn't. And that happened to coincide, that kind of exit happened to coincide with the 2008 financial crisis. And so for a decade, until the last year or so, it's really been hard for people to get investments in new types of technology for energy, especially startups. But at the same time, the 2008 financial crisis, at least in the United States, it led to a very large stimulus bill, the Recovery Act. And in the Recovery Act, unlike anything that the Congress is currently considering, which is all just COVID financial impacts related, in the Recovery Act, there was a lot of money for new energy technologies. The Recovery Act was intended to put people to work. And so there was a lot of money in there for things that were considered to be shovel ready and a lot of energy projects, wind and solar, but even the carbon capture projects got a tremendous amount of stimulus there. There were grants created, there were investment tax credits created. Congress changed the partnership law so that government grant to a partnership that owned wind and solar projects, which is how most of them are owned, that would not be taxable. Up until that time, the only way you could avoid paying tax on a federal grant was if you were a corporation, not a limited liability company. So ironically, Congress really put a lot of money into stimulating the clean tech sector just at the time when the venture capitalists were getting out of it. And really, frankly, at a time when it moved more to the sector really makes more sense, in my view, for private equity than it does for venture capital, because private equity tends to fund projects instead of technologies. And with everything in the clean tech world, we don't have the ultimate efficiency and low cost version of a technology, but we have all the technology. If we want to deploy the technology, it's all there to be deployed commercially and then can grow up. I try to say to people, if we had waited until we had 12 megawatt offshore wind turbine, to start doing wind turbines at 100 kilowatts and then one megawatt, 1.5 megawatts and so forth, we never would have gotten to where we are now. And for many of these technologies, we're at the stage where, okay, it's not going to be the most efficient or least expensive version of what will ultimately be done in the world, but it's perfectly well, you can commercialize it right now and we could get started and we could sort of come down that ski tip cost curve where you start the first project is expensive, but you come down the curve to the nth project. We could be doing that right now. There'd been a lot of hope in recent weeks that Congress would do this in the next bill, which would be a stimulus bill. But instead, Congress has the depth of the financial crisis is so great that this next bill is going to be called COVID-4. It's just going to be, more financial assistance to small businesses and unemployed people and so forth, and a new bill to deal with stimulus for things such as new energy projects is either going to have to wait until later in the year or probably until after the election. I don't know, but you're probably aware that there's a lot of activity in Washington to put that bill together that will be the new stimulus bill, both authorization and funding for new energy technologies to be deployed. So I don't think this is going to end investment in clean tech just because we have a financial crisis. I do think that plunging oil prices, if they stay low, they will harm deployment of things we want to do in various ways. Some, for example, electric vehicles. If gasoline is selling, for under $2 a gallon, for some people, that takes away one of the incentives they had for getting an electric vehicle. That may slow down penetration by electric vehicles, but it won't stop it because there are a lot of other reasons why people do electric vehicles than just to avoid gas prices. Sorry, that's kind of a long answer, but it's a kind of a mix and match. There's some things that are similar, but there's some things that are different this time.
Yeah, I was going to say, have you observed a net positive or a net negative so far, given that, there's been articles out there of how electricity demand has dropped by 15-20% because people are staying at home, but then on the other side, there's not as much renewable deployment. Do you think there's been a net benefit, net negative, or is it still kind of a mix?
I don't have a good enough crystal ball, Jimmy, to really know. I'm just not that expert, and what I read, all the experts have differing opinions anyway. But a couple of things that are interesting, at least, to note. One is that during this quarantine period in the U.S., as is happening around the world, one side effect is that suddenly the air is getting clean, and you've all seen these pictures of the distant mountains as photographed from Delhi, and the mountains as photographed over past the blue skies of Los Angeles. Here in Seattle, where I live, we've had an interesting confluence of factors. We haven't had any rain and have just had clear blue skies for about 2 weeks in the middle of this, because of course very little driving is going on, very little industrial activity is going on. And although I've lived here for 70 years, I have never seen the air this clear. I'm like 90 miles from Mount Rainier, and I can, from my 34th floor condo, I can look at Mount Rainier and I can see individual crevasses on the glaciers of Mount Rainier. I mean, something never seen before from this distance. So I'd like to put one marker down, which is that we should all remember that even though the circumstances that drove this are terrible, it is not impossible to clean the air. It is possible to have cleaner air. That's one thing. But in terms of where it's all going, I just don't know, Jimmy. I'm working for, so I now work as a consultant, and I'm working for 6 climate-friendly companies, each doing different things. One of them is doing direct air capture of CO2. One of them is an advanced geothermal drilling company. One of them is a renewable natural gas company. 2 of them involve carbon capture from coal for technologies that would be useful in the developing world. One surface gasification with carbon capture and one underground coal gasification with carbon capture. And the biggest thing you notice is that people who have money that would be needed to fund these things and that, who were in discussions to fund various things, most of them are still going to keep working for, to keep funding projects and technologies where it's not market price of fuel that's the driver. It's where there's a mandate, there's a driver. So if you have, in the West Coast, for example, the states have adopted these clean energy laws now, statutory laws. And so people still need to get renewable natural gas at the moment. They can't get hydrogen, and fossil natural gas has a greater carbon intensity. If we can make geothermal less expensive, that's really important because we don't have other sources, renewable sources of firm capacity as well as firm energy and so forth. So where there are mandates or where big corporations like Microsoft or Amazon have committed themselves to decarbonization, it's almost as if things are just sailing along so far. But a prolonged recession, something like on the scale of the Great Depression, is going to affect the profits of these companies, how much money they have to spend when they could get something cheaper. The big struggle in climate is people like to buy, $8 offsets, some from forestry program or something, rather than spend money to directly limit emissions. And yet those programs turn out to be, a lot of them are kind of sketchy. And as you know, the forest is not necessarily a very permanent reservoir for carbon and so forth. If the companies are doing really well, they'll spend more to get a direct emission, like actually capture some carbon and geologically sequester it. But if they're not doing so well, they might meet their mandates by buying offsets. So there are lots of things like that we have to see play out.
And, Marta on the Q&A was asking what the impact would be of this unprecedented oil price mean for the renewables and clean tech. And so far, it sounds like so far so good, but a mixed bag.
In one sense, so far so good. And as I said, people who are in the middle of doing deals, most of them are just continuing to go do the deals if the driver for those technologies and projects comes from climate mandates. If, however, it's sensitive to the cost of alternatives, oil in particular, then I think there's going to be pauses. And probably the bigger thing is that people with money, the amount of money in the world hasn't been reduced. It's just the velocity of money, right? And so the people who really have all the money, tremendous numbers of them just sitting on the sidelines right now for a reason that's understandable. They do not know what's going to emerge, and so they don't know what they might be able to do with their money. One entity that, huge private equity fund that has been funding subsea cables in the electric power sector, they were saying last week about their hesitation to fund a company in doing this business that they've always funded is, well, we don't know what's going to come out of this in terms of what we could do with our money. We might be able to buy an airport. See, the possibilities of what will emerge are so hard to anticipate that people who have the investment capital to put into clean tech, some of them are trying to figure out if that's really where they want to put their capital and what other, possibly more profitable things they would have waiting for them if they husbanded their capital a little bit.
Interesting. Ben has a question about some of the carbon capture technologies that you're working on right now. Are there any policy changes that would be more, would help create more of this carbon capture technology and implement some of that?
Yes, there are. This one also is a little bit complicated. For wind and solar, the government, the first thing that happened for wind and solar was there were mandates, the state mandates, like utilities had to have a certain portfolio standard. They had to meet, 30% of their total power generation had to come from renewables. That actually was before the favorable tax treatment. And then Congress added all the favorable tax treatment. And even though there have been some ups and downs, for wind and solar, that has been a very steady policy regime. The mandates have just gotten higher, not lower. No one eliminated the mandates. And the tax regime, although it bounced up and down, and during the financial crisis, changed to direct grants instead of investment tax credits and so forth. The policy environment for those has been very stable, and it's what's led to the great massive deployment. And with massive deployment has come cost reduction, from the power that comes from these things. That's never been the case for carbon capture ever. There have only been sporadic little things that hit at it. But Congress did enact in 2017 this so-called 45Q credit, and the Section 45Q is a tax credit for taking carbon dioxide and geologically sequestering it. And if you geologically sequester it in something like a saline formation where you're getting no other economic value, you get $50 a ton. And if you are geologically sequestering it through enhanced oil recovery, you get $35 a ton. And Congress removed the limit on the total number of tons that could benefit from this. So in effect, it's the first time Congress had really set a price on carbon. And a lot of projects and a lot of stuff has been stimulated on carbon capture. However, the Treasury Department has waited 2 years to put out any regulations, and the statute has a timetable in it with deadlines that are now going to be hard to meet. So most of the carbon capture community is trying to push on Congress to extend the deadlines, make the program last longer, make it include direct air capture and so forth. So with some policy changes and with the constancy and patience on the part of the government, there could be a lot of carbon capture. I do not see any carbon capture in the US forthcoming for power plants that use coal. I think that ship has sailed. But I do think for the rest of the world, that's absolutely essential. I think unless there's carbon capture on coal in the developing world, it's hard to imagine how we can ever achieve our climate objectives. But in the US, it'll be mostly on natural gas. And fortunately, it's fortunate that there is good technology for capturing carbon from natural gas power plants. It's not being deployed because there hasn't been a financial incentive or mandate to do it, but it's starting under 45Q. There are some people starting to do it. And there's also the new technology that probably a lot of your listeners have heard about, called net power, which is a technology to allow you to use natural gas to generate power and capture 100% of the CO2 or 99.9%. It's using a technology invented in the UK by an engineer named Rodney Allam, and it's called the Allam cycle. And the Allam cycle is basically a steam turbine that is adapted to, instead of being driven by steam, it's actually driven by CO2, compressed CO2. And this is, the pilot plant has been built and operated in Texas. It's receiving a lot of investment, this technology, and with luck, it'll be deployed. But again, this is one where really low natural gas prices might make people reluctant to spend a bunch of capital to come up with a new gas-fired power plant that captures carbon, rather than just run the gas-fired power plants that are already in existence at a higher fraction. Last thing on that, you're probably aware that in the US, 2/3 of the reduction in megawatt hours generated by coal have been replaced by gas. 1/3 has been replaced by renewables, and that third is driven by the mandates. So natural gas has moved into that market, and without carbon capture, believe it or not, natural gas is not that much better than coal. Natural gas is definitely not a climate solution if you're not capturing carbon from it.
Mm-hmm. Could you give us a really quick primer on the different parts of carbon capture? I think people are generally more familiar with renewable energy just because it's in the news a lot more. But what's the difference between geological, direct air, the coal, the natural gas, the various components that you're talking about? Could you give us just a quick overall map of the market?
Yeah. Start with the point that in the absence of climate concerns, there's really no reason to capture CO2. It's not toxic, it's not flammable, it's an inert gas that exists naturally in the atmosphere. It's not harmful to people unless you happen to be in the bottom of a hole and someone puts CO2 on top of it, because CO2 is heavier than air. And so you can suffocate in a CO2 environment. And it does happen occasionally. A couple of skiers skied into up on Mammoth in California, they skied into a depression that was there because of hot gas coming out of the mountain, and they died because the bottom layer was CO2. I mean, that can happen. But the reason you want to get it out of the atmosphere is because of the climate effect. So working backwards, capturing it directly from the air, which can be done by technology, or it could be done by natural things like the forest programs and so forth. Capturing it directly from the air is something that we're always going to have to do, because even if we get to net zero, we have historic emissions that are up in the atmosphere now that are too high, and there are always going to be sources of CO2 emissions that you can't capture, and we can't stop. So if you think even in the current carbon cycle, when wood rots, for example, if it rots on the surface of the earth, it's going to produce CO2, and if it rots underwater, it's going to produce methane, which is even worse in some respects for the climate. So we're going to constantly need to remove carbon from the air, and to do that, if we're going to remove it by mechanical means, we have to have a place to put it, and the best place to put it is geological. A lot of people think, well, you can take this CO2 when you capture it and you can use it for things, and it's true. You can make building materials out of it. You can use CO2 as a kind of a fertilizer for algae plants if you want to make biofuels. But the volumes involved are so huge that you're not going to get there by figuring out how to use the CO2. The only way that you can get to where we need to go under the climate models, and this is the IPCC, the UN models, the International Energy Agency, and nowadays most of the mainstream climate scientists, the only way you can get enough out is to go to geological sequestration. So when you put it underground, your choices of where to put it to keep it secure so that it doesn't leak are limited to a few categories. One category, of course, if you can find a depleted natural gas field, there's a lot of room in there. You can put it in that, but there's not that much. That's one thing. You can put it in a depleted oil field for enhanced oil recovery, where it works really well. We have almost 50 years of experience with that. In the Permian Basin of Texas alone, they're injecting about 50 million tons a year, new tons, and about 100 million tons a year when you count the recycled part. And that's gone on for 40 years with no accidents and no leaks. You can keep 99% of it down that way. When you put it in the oil field, it acts as a solvent. It brings up additional oil that can't otherwise be recovered. But when the oil comes up, so does the CO2, and the CO2 depressurizes and it's separated, and then it's re-injected and put back into the well. And in the end, through that tripping, 99% of it will stay underground. And in the long-term underground, it forms carbonates with stone and so forth. And here in the US, the amount of carbon that you put underground when you do that is greater than the amount of carbon you get out in the oil. So it actually, at the margin, is a CO2 reduction thing. And at the margin, that barrel displaces a barrel that was produced somewhere else by some other means. And there's no other means that sequesters the carbon. So in terms of sinks, that's good. Where the ultimate sinks are going to be in these so-called saline formations. Some people call them saline aquifers, but that really gets people confused because these are not aquifers in the sense we think of them. They're just deep underneath most oil fields and even non-oil fields, deep underneath a huge portion of the total rocks in the world are these formations that are filled with saline, deep brines, you could call them. And if you inject CO2 into those deep brines, they will more quickly form rocks, carbonate. But if you don't remove some of the brine, then you're overpressurizing that reservoir, and you can cause a cracking of the cap rock. The oil fields are great because they're formations from which it's almost impossible to remove anything. You have to drill a well to get down there, and then the only source to the surface is the well, and you can always monitor the well and cap the well if something's going wrong. So oil fields are the great kind of bridge to figuring out saline. The Norwegians are way ahead of everybody else. They have saline fields that they're injecting into. The Australians do as well. but most of that CO2 is coming not from sources that humans created. It's almost all of it is coming from geological CO2 that was naturally occurring. And it comes about because the Norwegians and the Australians are extracting natural gas, and the reservoirs from which they're extracting it produce CO2 as well. There's CO2 down there along fossil CO2 along with the gas. The technologies for capturing it, they basically divide into two categories. It's a little oversimplification, but either you take the carbon out of the feedstock before you burn anything. That's called pre-combustion capture. So with a coal gasification plant, which is like a refinery for coal, you use a thermochemical reaction in the gasifier to split the carbon from the hydrogen. And then you remove the carbon and sequester it and take the hydrogen and use that to, for example, operate a combustion turbine. So the only thing you burn in the end is the hydrogen. So with pre-combustion capture, gasification, no coal is burned. Coal just is a chemical feedstock that gets broken down. And that's why, for me, it's the technology that's existed for 100 years, but people didn't try to capture the carbon from it in the past. In the old days, our cities were lit by gas lamps, you maybe know, and though that gas, before natural gas pipelines existed, that came from coal, and they had these plants all over the world and outside cities to create town gas. Jimmy, you'll remember Lake Union Gasworks Park. That was a coal gasification plant, 100 years old now, to create this town gas for street lighting. So the technology itself is all commercial. But the more common form is called post-combustion capture, where you burn the coal or you burn the natural gas, and then in the flue gases, the exhaust, you pull the carbon out using amines currently. These are chemicals that attract the CO2, glom onto the CO2, and then when you want to, you can inject some energy, and then they'll release the CO2. So that's how a lot of it goes on. So post-combustion capture, you're taking it out of flue gases. Pre-combustion capture, you're taking it out of the feedstock. Direct air capture, you're taking it out of the air using the same basic technology as the amines. As post-combustion capture, you do have something that the CO2 sticks to. One last thing on this. A lot of focus now on forests, and forests can take up a lot of CO2. If we had a real afforestation program, we could put a lot of CO2 into forests. But the limitations are as follows. Mathematically, there's no way to put enough CO2 in the forest to avoid the need for geological sequestration. And number two, forests are an inherently unstable reservoir because they can burn down, or human beings can change what they want to do with the forest. Geological sequestration is a stable reservoir because once the CO2 is down there, it can't get out. And if it started to get out, it would be getting out in small quantities that you'd be able to detect, and you could stop it getting out. So we shouldn't set these up as, they should be seen as complementary, but I'm a little concerned that there are people in the world who think, well, if we do it with trees, we don't have to do it underground, and that's just not right mathematically.
Great. Well, thank you for that
answer, but you asked a complicated question.
Well, thanks for giving us that outlay. I think it's important to know that there's many ways to sequester, and they happen at different parts of the supply chain, just as much as the pre and the post, the geological versus the biological sequestration. There are differences in technologies. And I guess one last question on this, which is, have you noticed where pre-COVID, I guess, the investors were who were funding these types of efforts? And do you think that will change post-COVID with, the various things we've talked about earlier?
For carbon capture is such a frustrating world because the whole idea was started by climate activists and got no support from the fossil fuel industry, no support from the electric utilities. In fact, they were all worried that if you proved that carbon capture could be done, then all of a sudden it'd be required. So they just were not supportive. But the environmental community was pushing it. When it finally achieved some technological maturity, the climate community, large portion of it, turned against it because they thought the so-called moral hazard of, if we have a method for removing CO2 from the air, that will become permission, to give people to go on emitting. Now, thanks in part to I think it's Colin Hepburn at Oxford, the world's gas producers have recognized that if you think of the atmosphere analogous to a landfill, it has a limited capacity, and most of that capacity has already been taken up. And every day that you're not charging anybody to put stuff in it, the coal world is putting in a lot. They're going to use it up. Coal is going to use up all the headroom left in the atmosphere, which means the gas producers wouldn't be able to produce their gas, even with carbon capture. And so, last year, the largest gas producers in the world have become really, really interested in funding direct air capture. So that companies like Carbon Engineering, which has a great technology for removing CO2 directly from the atmosphere, now they're being funded by Chevron and Occidental Petroleum, BHP. And now, now that we finally have the hydrocarbon industry on board, the attack from the environmental side has also increased, because why would these guys be funding it if they didn't, want permission to go on producing? And none of them would admit it in public, but mostly they're funding it because they want to drive a stake through the heart of the coal industry, so that they're able to, continue to produce their reserves and yet meet overall global climate objectives. And that's, I think, the main driver. So that's been a big change, but it's frustrating, because to me, the great moral hazard is this: if you look at any one of the models, any reasonably accepted model, you cannot get to net zero without geological carbon capture and storage. And to me, the moral hazard is failing to develop a technology that is going to be needed for climate, because you're worried that someone else is going to treat that as permission to do something. And particularly this is true of the mechanical means of reducing CO2, pulling it out of the air. Because again, if you look in the models, there is no generally accepted model where you can avoid it. It's going to be needed, and it's going to have to continue. As I said, once we're at net zero, we still have to pull carbon out of the air, both the old carbon we put there and the carbon that we just can't otherwise capture, that'll continue even from natural sources. So that's my long peroration on this, but I think that, to me, I wish we could just welcome the hydrocarbon industry deciding to invest in carbon capture, because it's a necessary technology and their money and experience can help move it along. But we will have a public policy battle about that because of these competing moral hazards.
Great, thank you. So Alex also asks questions about renewable and nuclear energy, saying
look at all these,
how.
But look at all these great questions that Ben is putting up there. Ben, we're going to get to your questions honest. These are really good.
The questions are coming through in a couple of different windows.
The answers are yes, yes, no, I don't know, and yes. Okay, go ahead, Jimmy.
Ben, hopefully that was enough for you. Yeah. But we'll come back to that in a little bit. So Alex asked the question about renewable and nuclear, talking about the UK government's position to get substantial new nuclear by 2050 to be able to meet the carbon targets. Do you think that's still a valid concern, or do you think those are outdated?
I am not anti-nuclear at all. It depends on what your priorities are, and my priority is climate. So for climate, nuclear is a really valuable technology, and I want to see it advance. I think experience, and this is just my view, of course, it's not like stating a universal truth. But I think experience with nuclear plants, with high-speed rail networks, with large carbon capture projects such as the one I was in charge of, I think there's something inherent in these really massive mega projects that makes them more expensive than anyone planned on, and makes them take a lot longer than anyone planned on. And I can tell you, if you want, the reasons why I think that is true. But the nuclear industry for a time was moving in this other direction of small modular reactors and ways to do nuclear plants that would be standardized and easily to locate and much, much less expensive. And working on ways to integrate them into the power system. But somewhere that large parts of that industry got cold feet, and they kind of went back to the big traditional type reactors, these mega projects. And so to me, when I watch what's going on at Hinkley Point, It's like, this really ought to be the lesson of these mega projects. They're going to cost way more than you thought, and they're going to take a lot longer. And to me, that is not the way that we are most likely to be able to make good climate use of nuclear. You asked about something besides nuclear, though. What was the other?
Oh, nuclear versus renewable what
Well, of course,
putting it to provide baseload.
Yeah. Okay. So if I can just give a little story here, I did not know anything about the energy system when I got out of law school, which was in 1975. I literally knew nothing about it. And I got thrust into it as a lawyer for a variety of reasons. And back in 1975, when you wanted to say that someone was ignorant about the electric power system, the way you dismiss that person was you say, that fellow doesn't know the difference between a kilowatt and a kilowatt hour. And I would never have believed that 45 years later, this is still the fundamental problem with advocates and policymakers who, get into the grid and how to run the grid, is they don't understand the difference between energy and capacity. And so now when I give a speech in public, I'll tell that little story, and then I'll ask in the audience, I'll say, everybody who knows the difference, I say, taking account of inflation, now we have to say the difference between a megawatt and a megawatt hour, but who in the audience knows the difference between a megawatt and a megawatt hour? And usually about 10% of the people raise their hands. And if I'm really mean, I pick one of them and say, why don't you explain it to everybody in the room? And of course, that's pretty hard to do. The problem with these, the limitation of wind and solar has been inherent from the beginning, and that is that they are intermittent sources of power generation. And consequently, the only thing they produce is energy. They do not produce any reliable, sustained capacity. You cannot flick a light switch and turn them on, if it's the middle of the night and it's not windy. The value of nuclear and of coal plants and gas-fired plants, leaving aside the climate problems that they created, and of geothermal, is that they have firm capacity. They will be there when you want to turn the light on, and they'll supply the energy that you need at that point, which is what firm capacity consists of. And so all these efforts to integrate renewables into the grid, it was no problem when they were like 7%. But you can see, if any of you, some of you must be following what goes on in the California Independent System Operator, where they have daily curves showing the sources of generation, and other parts of the world. California is only now at like 24% penetration of renewables, and they intend to go way, way higher than that. And they're having tremendous problems on that grid if you think about these things as being problems. Number one, they have to use other forms of energy when the sun ramps down in the evening and before it ramps up in the morning. And those sources of energy are either dirty, like gas-fired power plants, or they're in a sense only temporarily available, like a lot of hydroelectric power from the Pacific Northwest is used in the evening ramp down period in California and the morning startup period. But that power is not going to be available to California forever, because the Pacific Northwest is going to have to find ways to use it itself for its own loads. So integrating those renewables is hard. This is why everybody's focusing on batteries, because if you can store energy from the sun at midday that you don't need to meet a load in the battery, then you can use it for ramp down period in the evening, which is a really, really good use of batteries. Really good use of batteries is to shift power generation a few hours in one direction or another with renewables, or alternatively, to shave your peaks, to use batteries at peak hours instead of having to generate at peak hours and so forth. Those are really good use of batteries. But now think about a place like the Pacific Northwest, where we have all these clean energy renewable mandates. But in the Northwest, it's easy to have a 2-week period where the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. So even if you had a battery which lasted for 2 weeks, which it's not even in the range of contemplation yet, what would you do on the 15th day if you could charge it? And then I'm sure a lot of your audience here can think about the math too. How much extra wind and solar capacity do you have to install to be able to charge a battery that will be able to carry a load when the wind and solar is not there? And how much extra battery capacity do you need, and so forth? So I think that if we're going to make really good use of these, we have to integrate them in the grid. And what the nuclear people, to bring this back around, what the nuclear people are now focusing on, it doesn't make any sense to run the nuclear plant up and down because the power is basically free. It's the cost of the nuclear plant. It's the capacity that's expensive, not the energy. So, and that's why the renewables advocates have thought of nuclear as being irrelevant, because you can't run it up and down. You can't use it to make up for the wind and solar when they're not there. But the nuclear people have figured out, yeah, you can do that. You run the nuclear plant flat out, and when the power is needed on the grid to make up for the wind and solar being intermittent, then the nuclear plant supplies power to the grid. And when it's not supplying power to the grid, what are the other things you can do with power? Well, you can use it to run electrolysis machines, and from that you can produce hydrogen. So this idea, this is part of the big driver for the hydrogen economy, is where are we going to get all the hydrogen? And nuclear plant advocates are saying, if we have nuclear plants, the nuclear plant can back up the wind and solar when the wind and solar are not producing, or when the batteries have been exhausted. And meanwhile, the nuclear plant can be producing hydrogen at basically zero energy cost. And so you'll see a lot more of that. You'll hear this idea about integration, or it can run pump storage projects, or it can charge batteries. You know, people are trying to figure out what are the uses for nuclear in a world where we're dominated on the grid by intermittent sources of power like wind and solar.
Interesting. Let's get to one of Ben's question now. Outside of the enhanced oil recovery, what do you think are the highest direct short-term applications for direct air capture CO2?
Yeah, well, Climeworks is mentioned here, and Climeworks is a carbon capture technology directly from the air, and they sequester it underground. And they have a consumer model where you can buy directly. You can pay Climeworks to put CO2 underground. Obviously, they need a revenue source if they're going to do this. And so if I want to offset my carbon emissions, not by some fanarchy thing that would never check out in the real world, but by something that actually affects the atmosphere, I can buy that from Climeworks, and they will, if I pay them $1,000, they'll put underground $1,000 worth of CO2. Or if I figure that my transcontinental trip in airplanes is responsible for 3 tons of carbon emissions over the course of a couple of trips, then I can pay Climeworks to put 3 tons underground. So that's one model. But the price per ton of the Climeworks technology is high compared to other forms of capture. And I'm not sure that, I mean, it'll get lower as they do more, but I'm not sure how well it's going to scale. So it's a valuable tool, but like every other tool in the climate toolbox, it's not a sufficient tool. So other things you can do, you can put the captured CO2 into building materials. Certain building materials can like concrete, you can put it in concrete, for example. You can, as I said, you can feed algae farms with it if you want to use algae for biofuels. But there you have the problem that with algae farms, you don't want to go vertical with tankage. It gets really expensive. You want to be spread out flat, like a big pond. And although CO2 will help grow the algae, if you wanted to capture, say, the total amount of CO2 that comes from like one relatively medium-sized coal plant, if you captured all of it, you would need an algae farm the size of Lake Champlain. It's just the scale of what needs to be captured is so much greater than what these uses of CO2 are, that I think we have to be careful, because on the one hand, we definitely want to use all the CO2 that we can use economically, because after all, it costs money to separate it. But on the other hand, you don't want people to fall into the trap of believing that the total volumes of CO2 that we need to keep out of the atmosphere and that we need to remove from the atmosphere, you don't want them to think that there will be markets that are big enough for that, because there won't be markets big enough for that. We're going to have to pay. We have to pay somehow to put CO2 underground.
Great.
And even if you believe in trees, even if you believe in the trillion trees model, that's a lot of money to get a trillion trees out there too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me change tacks a little bit. And I want to ask you about your experience on the President's Council at Ceres, and start talking about some corporate efforts behind climate action and things like that. Ceres started the GRI standards over 20 years ago. What is the organization doing today that is leading and that gets you really excited about actions on climate change?
Well, first of all, I am such a marginal participant in series that you really should be asking other people. I joined because they have a different approach to carbon emissions reductions than what I usually work on. Most of what I usually work on is like direct reduction. And what you're looking for is direct incentives to enable people to afford to commercialize and deploy technologies that will, directly reduce emissions in some fashion. Ceres has got a more indirect approach, and they've got a lot of major industry to buy into it, which is, what if we were to, for example, just force every company to disclose what its carbon impacts are? And moreover, if they're publicly traded companies, what if we force them to come up with a climate resiliency plan, which is, how are you going to retain value for your shareholders if you assume a world in which carbon emissions have to be reduced? And Ceres has been really, really good at that. And they've been able to bring the industry along with them. And as you're probably aware, in the Obama administration, they've got those rules adopted by the Securities and Exchange Commission. So at least for public companies, that was good. In the Trump administration, they've thrown all that out, along with every other thing that Obama did and anything good for the climate. But that type of approach by Ceres, I think, is they're able to get in their tent, really huge corporations that otherwise would resist a direct mandate to be forced to do X or forced to do Y. And that's a valuable contribution. But again, not all of these things are tools in the toolkit. And what we have to avoid is thinking that any one of these tools by itself is sufficient for the scale of the problem that we face, because none of them is sufficient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the questions Vaughn asked is, how much investment do you think is required for the necessary amount of CO2 that you're talking about?
Globally?
Yeah.
Globally, in the last 2 decades alone, we've spent about $4 trillion in installing wind and solar. And we haven't spent globally yet even $100 million on forms of carbon capture. So it's all about scale. And for that one tool, you'll need trillions of dollars. But the need for the trillions of dollars isn't specific to carbon capture. It's specific to, being at 415 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere on a trajectory that is the steepness of which is increasing instead of leveling off. And knowing that roughly, although, it's all rough, but roughly at 450 parts per million, which we're approaching really rapidly, we're accelerating right now towards 450. The scientists have determined that at that level, that's associated with 2.0 degrees centigrade increase from pre-industrial times. And that 2.0, the significance of the 2.0 is, that is the level at which the scientists had calculated that there would be dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate, or DAI. Of course, what we're experiencing is that we're having dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate, and we aren't there yet. We're not even up to 2 degrees yet. And it's already, you've got the Arctic melting and villages sinking into the mud, and walruses are not going to be able to feed their babies, and polar bears are going to run out of food, and we have fire situations that are very serious and bad. And when the Coast California fires burned, they reduced a huge amount of CO2 back in the atmosphere. So the negative feedback loop from that is really bad. We've got Antarctica melting so rapidly that Antarctica is actually rising in relation to sea level, because the amount of weight that is being taken off the continent from the melted ice is allowing the so-called lithostatic bounce. It's able to, the rock is able to rise up because it has this weight off it. We've got hurricanes forming at faster rates. I don't think you can blame tornadoes on climate change yet. There's no well-established link. But hurricanes are caused by the ocean being really, really warm, and the ocean is getting really, really warm. When people were doubters, climate change doubters, were saying, well, atmospheric temperatures are not increasing as fast as you modelers said they would. The principal reason was that the ocean was increasing in temperature faster. It was taking up more of the temperature hit as it took up more CO2. But the ocean is pretty well saturated with CO2. It's got acidity problems now. CO2 is an acid. It's really harming shellfish in different parts of the world and so forth. So I don't know what got me started on this rant, but you
Just
know,
how much investment was needed, and basically
yeah.
it's a lot.
Oh, but let's turn it around on a positive side. Trillions of dollars are needed for mitigation. Trillions of dollars are going to be needed for adaptation. All of that represents jobs, employment, income. When computers came along, they put the typewriter industry out of business. And I'm sure there were a lot of dislocated people who worked in the typewriter industry. But I don't think anyone argued that computers have been bad for the economy. They've been good for the economy. I remember the day, I'm old enough now to remember the day I was walking down 2nd Avenue in Seattle past the K&E store. K&E was the great seller of slide rules. And in the display window were, all these, and they were ivory faced slide reels too. They were beautiful. They even had circular ones and the regular, and all we learned, how to do these computations on slide reels. And it was the same day that I first heard about this Texas Instrument thing called a calculator. And I looked in that store window and I thought, I should buy these up because they'll probably be really valuable someday as antiques, So disruptive technologies do disrupt things. But the notion that dealing with climate is going to be bad for us economically, I just do not see it. I think the exact reverse is the case. I think if we spend these trillions and trillions of dollars, it's going to help build an economy, and it'll be a different economy. And what we should do that we've never done before is we've got to take care of politically the displaced people, because what we've seen is the people who get displaced by the disruption may be small in relation to the full employment, but they have a lot of political power and they get really angry and they can stop a lot of things, in its tracks because we failed to take care of them and figure out how to take care of them. And these are not easy problems. In eastern Montana, if you shut down these big coal-fired plants, you've got a really prosperous community right now. You will have no employment in a really prosperous community. And in Montana politics, it's too big a place. You can't ignore that. And if you could, it would be immoral. But finding out how we can help the people there, how can we help them if we shut down those plants so that they don't feel alienated against the climate, which is what's driving the shutdown of the plants? I do not have the answer to that, but you younger folks, you better find one.
Yeah. Well, that brings me to my last question, which is, if we're going to be spending trillions of dollars on this, where do you think is the expertise and the future skill set?
That's troubling too, because of the way people are being educated. Right now, everybody wants to go into computer programming, young people, number one, and some of that's definitely going to be needed. But we need construction workers. We need utility linemen. We need dispatch controllers. We need chemical plant operators. We need all these other types of engineering or construction related skills. And we're not producing these people. So for the most part, we've been relying on immigration, which is starting to cause a problem, right? And then we're relying on the Chinese to build these things and ship them over to us. And that's seeming going to get disrupted now in all of this. The craziest thing is in our education system, we bring in, I teach this course at UCSD last year. More than half of my students were from abroad, were from other countries. Not one of them could get a visa to work in the United States. So we give our best advanced resources in education to really highly educable people from abroad, but we don't let them stay in our country. So they go to Canada or they go somewhere else, or maybe they go home. So we have so many policies that are in the way, but I think what this boils down to for the end of this talk, I guess, is that we have to put the focus on decarbonization. It's not about renewables or about carbon capture or about nuclear, it's decarbonization. And if we focused on decarbonization and said, this is an existential threat, we've got to do this, we could train people, we could create the jobs and train people to play useful roles on every one of these tools that needs to be in the toolkit. But right now we are not doing it. So we're going to face a big shortage of people who want to do things other than create online video games.
Great. Well, Eric, thank you so much for your time today and being part of this program. And also thank you to Said Business School for putting it together, and Hannah Evans, of course, for putting all the people together behind the scenes. For those of you who listened in all the way to the end, there will be a feedback survey out as part of a thank you for participating. And also, please consider joining the Global Energy WhatsApp group to continue these discussions amongst ourselves. And also, just as a quick plug, Said Business Schools is having a Leadership in Extraordinary Times, which is a bi-weekly series with Dean Peter Tufano, and he will be talking to Hiro Mizuno, who was the former CIO of the Japan's government pension investment fund, to discuss long-term thinking, sustainability, and social factors in the investment decisions. So thank you again for attending today, and I look forward to seeing you guys next time.
Well, I mean, excuse me, Jimmy, will you one thing? There's so questions here I didn't answer. Just give people my email address. I'm happy to answer questions by email if people want to email me.
Absolutely. Happy to send that around.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.